occurred globally. And at this point you say to yourself, well, okay, maybe this is just an accident, all right? And actually, if you read, it's very interesting reading Stieglitz's book on globalization and its discontents, because what he says is, well, you know, actually it seemed like somehow or other we were making the poor poorer and the rich richer, and it was like this was an accident somehow or other of policy. Well, my argument is, no, it's not an accident. It was actually a political project. And actually, if you go back in the 1970s, it's not hard to reconstruct who was engaged in that project. Now, there's a very good book, which I recommend to you, written in 1985 by a journalist called Thomas Edsall, called The New Politics of Inequality. And basically, he documents how all the think tanks that were set up in the 1970s, the Heritage Foundation, et cetera, sort of started, getting into the act. How the Business Roundtable got set up in 1972. How the Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell, wrote a memo to the American Chamber of Commerce saying, business is getting a bad deal. We have to have a collective action to try to rescue the reputation of business, and the American Chamber of Commerce has to lead that action. And after that, the American Chamber of Commerce got together with the National Association of Manufacturers, went to Washington, set up vast lobbying institutions. And then came the fantastic stuff with the political action committees. In the wake of Watergate, they were only allowed to contribute $5,000 to any one campaign. And in 1978, Reagan and William Simon, then Secretary of the Treasury, who had a permanent role to play in the New York fiscal crisis, what they did was they went around to all the political action committees and said, look, there's no point you just giving $5,000 to some influential senator, no matter whether it's Democratic or Republican. You have to collectively get together, and all of you PACs have to organize yourself so that you put your 5,000, 5,000, 5,000, and we get right-wingers elected to Congress. And this was the Business Roundtable and all the rest of them taking over the Republican Party. But then, of course, the Republican Party also needed some kind of popular base, and that's when, interestingly, Jerry Falwell forms the Christian Majority in 1978. The evangelicals start to come into the whole kind of picture, and we're seeing the end game of that kind of Republican Party political process working out around us right now. But this was a takeover of the Republican Party, turning it into a class instrument. And that class instrument was very explicit in what it was doing. I mean, for example, the CUNY case was fascinating. I was fascinated to find out that the Business Roundtable played, which is about, all the big corporations covering about 50% of US GNP. The Business Roundtable took an active role in the CUNY tuition debate. How did it do it? It paid all kinds of people to publish learned articles, seemingly academic independent scholars, talking about how much better the educational quality would be if you paid tuition. And these were all published in that radical journal, the Reader's Digest. Again, paid for by the Business Roundtable. Then what the Business Roundtable paid for was the reproduction of all of those articles in every college newspaper around CUNY campuses. I mean, they were really getting, people say to me, you're talking conspiracy theory. I say, no, this is a political project. It was a systematic political project. And it was about restoring class power. And by the time they got Reagan elected, they knew they were on their way. And this was, I think, a very significant aspect of it. Now, this then brings us back to the question of how then does neoliberalization occur in any circumstance, in any society, anywhere? And here the answer is you just can't simply say it's US going in there and doing it. The Chilean case was not US imperial policies imposing that on Chile. No, it was not that. What it was a Chilean bourgeoisie actually invoking US support for an internal coup. And a lot of the IMF restructuring does not occur because the US imposes it, It occurs because some internal class formation can't do it on its own and wants to blame the IMF. And a classic case of that right now is Argentina. In Argentina, everybody blames the IMF. The government blames the IMF, and there's a great charade goes on where the IMF turns up and Kirchner won't talk to them and tells them to get lost and all this kind of stuff. And says, but actually if you look carefully at what happened in Argentina, as everybody knows, the devaluations that occurred there transferred something like $14 billion from common people's savings into somebody's pockets. Whose pockets? not the IMF's pockets, no, it went to recapitalize the banks, and actually it was what somebody in a neoliberal think tank said, it was just robbery of the banks by the political and economic elite. So again, what we find again and again are these kinds of processes at work. So therefore, in each country, what you find is a struggle between a particular elite. The Swedish case is particularly interesting. The Swedish case, they again tried to take over certain think tanks and all the rest of it, and every time there's a crisis in Sweden, they wrote learned kind of treatises on why the problem is too much of the welfare state, too much state intervention and the like. But they couldn't get anywhere. They had such a strong union kind of movement. So one of the things they did was to say, let's go into the European Union. The European Union is more neoliberal than we are. Then they'll all be bound by the Maastricht Accords, and then that's the way we can consolidate neoliberal politics in Sweden. In each case, you'll find this particular kind of thing going on. And the China case, and I have a whole chapter on China, which is fascinating to go through. The China case, what you see is, again, immense concentrations of wealth emerging in China. It's gone from one of the most egalitarian societies in the world in 1980 to one of the most inegalitarian societies in the world right now. And there's an interesting kind of question as, how is that relating to the political party and the like? So there are many interesting kinds of questions. So the main thesis that seems to make sense right now is to say, look, when we look at this whole kind of thing, what we're looking at over the last 30 years has been a restoration or reconstitution of class power. Not necessarily to those people who were in the upper classes in 1970, because there's been a morphing of who the capitalist class is. It's much more about financial services and legal apparatuses and all the rest of it. So there's been a morphing of all of that. But nevertheless, capitalism has re-established one of its main traits, which is a tremendous concentration of wealth within a very small group of the population. And we see this happening everywhere where neoliberalization takes hold. So this is, if you like, one of the major theses. But then what I wanted to do was to say, well, okay, what are we looking at now? Are we looking at a crisis situation? Is neoliberalization working? It's not doing very well from the standpoint of accumulation. So where is it getting its wealth from? Where are these? And this is where I use one of the concepts I used in the New Imperialism, which is a lot of it's about accumulation by dispossession. You read all this data about how wealthy these people are becoming in this country, and then you go and you say, oh, the workers, how many pension schemes have gone down the chute recently? How many people have lost their pension rights? How many people have lost their healthcare rights? What's going on with General Motors and Delphi and United Airlines and all the rest of it? And you suddenly kind of look at this and you kind of say, look, on a daily basis, what we're being fed is these people are being deprived of their rights. These people are getting richer and richer and richer. And this leads me, if you like, to one kind of very simple kind of conclusion. There's a lot of struggle against neoliberalization around the world, and it's usually against some specific aspect of it. Environmental degradation here, misappropriation of resources there, dispossession of rights through eminent domain somewhere else, problems of workers being laid off, outsourcing, all those kinds of things. So there are many individual struggles going along. But when you look at the total package of what has happened, it seems to me we've actually had, for the last 30 years, a sophisticated class war waged against all of us. And if it looks like class war, and it feels like class war, and why don't we call it class war? And why don't we engage on it back? Thanks very much.